Hammer of the Gods. Writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. Edited, translated, and arranged by Stephen Metcalf. Chapter 1. Dead God. We have learned better. We have become more modest in all respects. We no longer trace the origin of man back to the quote spirit or to the quote divinity. We have ranked him back among the animals. We believe him to be the strongest of the animals on account of his supreme cunning. His spirituality issues from this. On the other hand, we must beware of the kind of vanity which strives to express itself here. The vanity which believes man to be the great secret purpose of animal evolution. Man is categorically not the crown of all creation. Every creature stands at his side, at the same stage of perfection. And even here, we assert too much. Man is, in a certain sense, the most unsuccessful animal, the most sick, the animal which has most dangerously deviated from its instincts, but, by that token, also the most interesting. With regard to the animals, Descartes was the first thinker who, with considerable courage, dared to think of animals as machines. The whole of the science of physiology is given over to proving this assertion. Logically, we do not exclude man from this, as Descartes did. Our current knowledge of man is actual knowledge to the extent that it is knowledge of him as a machine. Hitherto, man was endowed with, quote, free will as a gift from a higher order. Today, we have taken this will away from him, in the sense that will can no longer be taken to be an intellectual faculty. What was formerly known as, quote, will only designates a product, a kind of individual reaction which necessarily crystallizes on a host of partly contradictory, partly consonant stimuli. The will no longer, quote, affects nor, quote, moves anything. Formerly, one could see in man's consciousness, in his, quote, spirit, the justification for his higher origin, his divine nature. To attain perfection, man was told to suck his senses back into himself, like the withdrawing head of a tortoise, to renounce any kind of commerce with all that is terrestrial, to forget his mortal body. Then the larger portion of him would survive as, quote, pure spirit. We have learned better in this case, too. Becoming conscious, or, quote, spirit, is a symptom of imperfection in the organism, an experimenting, a fumbling, a botching, and a kind of labor through which an unnecessarily large measure of nervous energy is expended. We refute the idea that anything can be made perfect as long as it continues to be made conscious. Quote, pure spirit is just a pure idiocy. If we remove the nervous system and the senses, the mortal body, we miscalculate, and nothing more than that. Antichrist. The concept of substance issues from the concept of the subject, not the reverse. If we eliminate the soul, the subject as such, the foundation for substance in general vanishes. One processes intensities of being, one is stripped of all that which has being. The subject is the term with which we designate our belief in a unity which underlies all the manifold impulses of the highest feeling of reality. We take this belief to be the effect of a single cause. We believe so immovably in our belief that we come to conceptualize, quote, truth, quote, reality, and, quote, substance for its sake. Quote, the subject is the fiction we supply ourselves with that says that many similar states in us are the effect of a single substratum. But it is we who, in the first place, create the, quote, similarity of these states. Our adjusting them and making them similar is the fact, not their inherent similarity. Bracket. This latter point needs to be denied. Close bracket. Posthumous fragment. Must the whole of philosophy not, in the end, reveal the preconditions upon which the whole process rests? Our belief in the, quote, echo as a substance, as the only reality from which we can possibly ascribe reality to exterior things? The oldest form of, quote, realism is finally illuminated. The whole of the religious history of mankind is revealed to be the history of the superstition of the soul. And here we reach a limit. All of our thought involves this, bracket, with all its concepts of substance, accident, deed, doer, etc., close bracket. To let go of it means this, to no longer be able to think. A belief, no matter how indispensable it might be for the preservation of a species, has nothing to do with truth. For example, the fact is that we need to believe in time, space, and motion, but we do not feel compelled to ascribe an absolute reality to them. Posthumous fragment. All that enters our consciousness as a, quote, unity is always incredibly complex. We only ever possess an appearance of unity. The phenomenon of the body is a richer, more obvious, more palpable phenomenon, to be discussed first in terms of methodology, without reaching any decision as to its final significance. Posthumous fragment. My hypothesis. The subject as multiplicity. Pain as intellectual and totally dependent on the judgment of, quote, harmful, projected outwards. Pleasure is a kind of pain. The effect is always, quote, unconscious. The inferred and imagined cause is transposed onto what follows in time. The only force that exists produces the same effect as the will. It commands other subjects, which change as a result. The continuous, fleeting, transitory nature of the subject, quote, mortal soul. Number as a form of perspective. Posthumous fragment. Why start with the body and physiology? Because here we attain the correct idea of the exact nature of our subject unity, namely, as the governor at the head of a communal body, bracket, not as a, quote, soul or, quote, life force, close bracket, and also how these governors depend upon all that they rule, and how an order of rank and a division of labor are the conditions making possible the whole and its parts. In the same way, we investigate how living unities continually emerge and die out, and why the subject is not eternal, why the struggle manifests in commanding and obeying, and why a fluctuating index of the limits of power is part of light, is part of life. The relative ignorance in which the governor is kept as regards individual activities and even disturbances within the common body is one of the conditions upon which the exercise of rule depends. Thus we are also able to evaluate not knowing, the ability to see things on a larger scale. Simplification, falsification, perspectivism. The important thing is that we understand that the ruler and his subjects are of the same type, all feeling, willing, thinking, and that wherever, whenever we notice movement in a body, we learn to realize that there is a subjective, invisible life adhering to it. Movement is symbolism for the eye. It communicates that something has been felt, willed, or thought. Posthumous fragment. Consciousness. Consciousness is merely the last and most recent development of the organic, and, as such, is also all that is most incomplete and precarious. Consciousness gives rise to a multitude of errors that lead to the premature death of an animal or a man, a death which, quote, exceeds destiny, as Homer put it. If the preservative conjunction of the instincts was less powerful, and if it did not function, in general, as a regulating mechanism, then humanity would necessarily die. As a result of its misjudgments and fantasies, with its eyes wide open. As a result of its lack of rigor and its gullibility. In short, as a result of its consciousness. Without the former, humanity would have ceased to exist a long time ago. Before a function has fully developed and matured, it poses a threat to the organism, and it is just as well if, in the interim, it is subjected to some kind of tyranny. Consciousness is tyrannized, not least by our belief in it. One takes it to be the core of man, all that is continuous, eternal, final, and original in him. One takes consciousness to be a formative magnitude. One denies that it grows, that it is irregular. One believes it to constitute the, quote, unity of the organism, close quote. This absurd overinvestment and misunderstanding of consciousness has functional consequences in that it hinders consciousness from developing too quickly. Since they believe that they possess consciousness, men have not strained themselves too much in its acquisition, and things have never altered much in this respect. The task of ingesting knowledge and making it instinctive is only now beginning to dawn on humanity, and is still not clearly visible to the naked eye. It is a task that has only been noticed by those who have understood that hitherto we have lived by our errors alone, and that all our consciousness relates to errors. Okay, science. On the aim of science. What? Science should aim to give men as much pleasure and as little displeasure as possible? What would it mean if pleasure and displeasure were so tightly connected that whoever wanted as much as possible of the one must also suffer as much as possible of the other? That whoever wanted to learn how to savor, quote, jubilation up to the heavens, close quote, would also have to suffer, quote, depression to the point of death, close quote. Because things may well be like this. The Stoics certainly believed things to be ordered in this way, and, to their credit, they were consistent in that they wanted as little pleasure as possible in order for them to suffer as little displeasure as possible in their lives. Right now, you have this choice. Either as little displeasure as possible, numbness in brief, and in the final analysis, all socialists and other politicians have no right to promise any more than this, or as much displeasure as possible, as the price to be paid for an abundance of subtle, unknown pleasures. If you decide in favor of the former, and desire to cut away at the thresholds of human pain, you will also have to reduce the level of the capacity for joy. Science is capable of serving either end. At the moment, it is better known for its power to deprive man of his joys and make him colder, like a statue, a stoic. But it could also be found to be the great conductor of pain. At this point, the possibility of its counterforce opens up. It makes immense new galaxies of joy explode. Lagaya science. What is the most intense pleasure enjoyed by men who live in the state of war, characterizing those small, continually threatened communities governed by the strictest laws? In other words, what is this for vigorous, vengeful, vicious, untrusting souls who prepare themselves to face all that is most terrible and are hardened by the deprivations required by Moors? It is the enjoyment of cruelty. In circumstances such as these, it will be listed among the virtues of such a soul if it is inventive and insatiable in its lust for cruelty. The community feels nourished by cruelty and finds itself temporarily able to shake itself out of the gloom of perpetual anxiety and caution. Cruelty belongs among the archaic forms of humanity's festive joys. One might suppose that the gods also feel nourished and festive when offered the spectacle of cruelty, and it is thus that the idea insinuates its way into the world that voluntary suffering, torture that one inflicts upon oneself, has value. Gradually, a cultural milieu takes shape around this idea. All luxurious shows of well-being begin to arouse suspicion, and all severe and painful states begin to be viewed with confidence. The concept of the, quote, most virtuous member of the community comes to embody the moral value of frequent suffering, deprivation, a severe way of life, and self-mortification. Not as a means to the end of self-control and the desire for individual happiness, but as a virtue that makes the community appear good in the eyes of the evil gods, which reaches them in plumes of smoke from some endless atonement on a sacrificial altar. All the spiritual leaders who were successful in moving something in the inert but fertile muck of their moors needed both madness and voluntary torture to secure faith. And, first of all and most importantly, their faith in themselves. The more their own spirit moved along untried paths and was tortured by conscience and fear, the more cruelly they violated their own flesh, desires, and health, as if they wanted to offer their gods a substitute satisfaction, just in case they were enraged at the sight of customs that had been neglected and stirred themselves to fight against these new causes. Let us beware of believing that we have completely distanced ourselves from such a logic of feeling. Let only the bravest souls probe their own feelings about this. Every single step on the field of free thought and organic life has been fought for by means of spiritual and physical torments. Not just moving forwards, but all moving, motion, and change have immolated countless martyrs. Throughout the pathfinding millennia about which people think nothing when they speak, as is their habit, about, quote, world history, that pathetically small segment of human existence. And even according to this so-called world history, which is only ever a basic furor over the latest news, there is really no issue bigger than the primordial tragedy of the martyrs who wanted to move the swamps. Nothing has been more costly than this tiny fragment of human reason and the feeling of freedom which constitutes our pride. It is precisely this pride which makes it almost impossible for us to reckon with the incredible time span characterized by the Moors, which antedate, quote, world history, as the real and decisive history in the formation of the nature of humanity. Times when suffering was a virtue, revenge was a virtue, the violation of reason was a virtue, while well-being was a danger, madness was divine, and change was immoral and pregnant with disaster. If you think that all this has changed, and that humanity has changed its nature, well then, you who think you know men ought to better acquaint yourselves with yourselves. Daybreak. The idea of God twists all that is straight and makes all that stands up dizzy. What is this? Would time be abolished and all that is transitory be no more than a lie? To think like this makes the human frame totter in dizziness and vertigo, and brings waves of nausea to the stomach. I call it the dizzy affliction to think such a thing. I call it evil and misanthropic to think like this. All these teachings about the one and the perfect and the immovable and the sufficient and the intransitory. All that is intransitory. That is but an image. And all the poets lie too much. All the best images and parables should speak both of time and becoming. There should be a eulogy for and a justification of all that is transitory. Truly, I have followed paths through 100 souls, through 100 cradles, through 100 birth agonies. I have taken my leave of many things. I know the heartbreaking pains of the last hours before departure. But my creative will, my destiny, would have it be so. This will drew me away from God and all gods. What could there be to create if gods existed? Time and time again, this ardent, creative will drives me to mankind. Thus it brings the hammer down upon the stone. Sleeping in the stone, I see an image, the image of all my visions. My hammer crashes fiercely against its prison. Zarathustra.